The official report was clean, concise, and deeply unsatisfying. Zhurong, the Chinese Mars rover, had entered its planned hibernation mode to wait out the brutal Martian winter and a prolonged solar conjunction. Dust accumulation on its solar panels was higher than expected. Communication ceased. The mission was, for all intents and purposes, over. It was a plausible, almost mundane end to a historic mission. But the universe is rarely so neat. My name is Michio Kaku. I have learned that the most interesting truths are never in the official reports. They are in the whispers, the anomalies, the data points that don't fit the curve. The truth about Zhurong wasn't in what was said, but in what was left unsaid. The real story began not with silence, but with a scream. A week after the official announcement, I received a call. It was from a source deep within the International Deep Space Network, a brilliant astrophysicist I've collaborated with for years. He's one of the few people with access to the raw, unfiltered telemetry from global space assets, including the Tianwen-1 orbiter that relayed Zhurong's data. "Michio," he said, his voice strained, "you need to see the final packet from Zhurong, the real final packet, the one that came a millisecond before the connection was severed." In the world of space communications, every mission ends with a final data packet, a goodbye handshake that confirms a controlled shutdown. According to my source, Zhurong never sent one. What it sent instead was a chaotic, high-density burst of pure noise, a digital shriek. On the surface, it looked like a catastrophic system failure, a power surge frying every circuit at once. But buried within that shriek, hidden beneath layers of quantum encryption, was something else. Something that had sent a silent shockwave through the handful of people on Earth who knew about it. He sent me the file. It was less than a second of data, but it was the densest and most disturbing thing I have ever seen. It was a recording of a resonance, a specific repeating frequency pattern embedded within the static. But it wasn't a radio frequency. It wasn't mechanical. The frequency signature was geological. It matched, with terrifying precision, the low-frequency tremors recorded by NASA's InSight lander from deep within the Martian mantle. Zhurong's final transmission, its digital death cry, was a recording of a Marsquake. But that was impossible. The rover's seismometer was inactive during the shutdown sequence. It wasn't listening to the ground. So how could it be broadcasting the planet's own heartbeat in its final moment? It was as if a drowning man's last scream was a perfect multi-octave recording of the ocean's current. It made no sense unless the ground wasn't just shaking, unless the ground was the source of the transmission. I spent the next 48 hours in my study, surrounded by printouts of Martian topography and seismic wave analysis. I cross-referenced the coordinates of Zhurong's final position in Utopia Planitia with the InSight lander's data. Zhurong had gone silent at the precise epicenter of a series of deep rhythmic tremors, tremors that the official reports had dismissed as routine tectonic settling. But they weren't routine. They were too regular, too orderly, like a slow, deep breath. Utopia Planitia, the Nowhere Land Plain, a vast flat basin believed to be the site of an ancient Martian ocean. Satellite imagery has shown that its surface is covered in vast polygonal patterns kilometers across. The official explanation is that these are caused by the expansion and contraction of subsurface ice over millions of years, a simple geological process. But when I overlaid the seismic data with a high-resolution map of these polygons, a new chilling pattern emerged. The tremors weren't random, they originated at the vertices of these giant hexagons, pulsing in a coordinated sequential wave. One vertex would pulse, then the next, and the next, in a slow, deliberate cascade of energy that circled the entire basin. It wasn't a geological process, it was a circuit. The entire plain of Utopia Planitia, an area the size of Western Europe, was a single, integrated electronic circuit, and the Zhurong rover had parked itself right on top of one of its main power junctions. My mind reeled. What kind of natural process could create such a thing? The answer came from a field of theoretical physics I had long been fascinated with: crystalline intelligence. The theory posits that under immense sustained pressure over geological time, silicon-based life could form. Not biological life as we know it, with cells and DNA, but a vast, crystalline consciousness. A planetary mind whose thoughts are seismic waves and whose neurons are crystal lattices stretching for miles deep beneath the surface. A mind that thinks a single thought over the course of 1,000,000 years. A slumbering God made of rock and time. We have been sending rovers to Mars for decades. Noisy, metallic, electronically loud machines drilling into its skin. What if the planet wasn't dead? What if it was merely sleeping? What if our rovers were like flies buzzing around a sleeping giant? For 50 years, the giant didn't stir. But then Zhurong came along, and Zhurong did something no other rover had done in that location. It deployed a ground-penetrating radar, actively pinging the deep subsurface with electromagnetic pulses. It was trying to map the ancient coastline of the buried ocean. But what it did, unknowingly, was ring the doorbell of a sleeping god. Zhurong wasn't just a fly. It was a fly with a megaphone screaming directly into the giant's ear. And for the first time in eons, the giant began to stir. The rhythmic tremors were not a sign of the planet settling. It was a sign of the planet waking up. And Zhurong's final chaotic data packet, it wasn't a scream, it was a scan. The geological frequency wasn't just a recording, it was an active energy transfer. The crystalline consciousness of Mars had reached out, enveloped the rover, and in one final cataclysmic millisecond, it had read it. It had absorbed every piece of data, every line of code, every circuit pathway. The silence of the Zhurong rover wasn't a system failure, it was the silence of complete and total absorption. The rover had not been destroyed, it had been consumed, digested by a planetary mind that was trying to understand the strange, noisy pest that had appeared on its skin. We had just fed our most advanced technology to an ancient, slumbering intelligence we never knew existed. And in doing so, we had just let it know we are here. The realization that Mars itself might be a conscious entity was a paradigm shift of terrifying proportions. It reframed our entire history of planetary exploration from one of scientific discovery to one of unwitting trespass. We were not archaeologists exploring a ruin. We were burglars in a house we thought was empty, only to hear the owner beginning to stir in the bedroom upstairs. I immediately contacted my source again. I need the full, unredacted telemetry from the Tianwen-1 orbiter for the 24 hours after Zhurong went silent, I told him. Forget the rover. What happened to the orbiter? The official report stated that the orbiter continued its mission flawlessly, but my source's reply was a single cryptic sentence sent over an encrypted channel. Look at the thermal scans of Utopia Planitia. He sent me the file. The thermal imaging data from Tianwen-1 is designed to measure surface temperature fluctuations on Mars. It's used to study weather patterns and seasonal changes. But when I isolated the scans from the hours after Zhurong's disappearance, a new impossible pattern emerged. The giant polygonal structures on the surface of Utopia Planitia, the ones I had identified as part of a massive circuit, began to glow. Not with intense heat, but with a low, subtle, rhythmic pulse of thermal energy. The entire basin, thousands of square kilometers of it, was warming up, but only along the lines of the polygons. It was like watching the vascular system of a vast sleeping creature slowly fill with warm blood. The energy expenditure was colossal, equivalent to a dozen nuclear power plants. But there was no external source. The energy was coming from within the planet itself. The crystalline intelligence, having absorbed the Zhurong rover, was doing more than just waking up. It was powering up. I ran a Fourier analysis on the pulsing thermal pattern, hoping to find a mathematical structure. The pattern was complex, but it wasn't random. It was a modulated signal, a message being broadcast not in radio waves, but in heat. And the message was breathtakingly simple. It was a prime number sequence, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, and so on. The universal, unmistakable signature of intelligence. It was the planetary equivalent of a newborn baby opening its eyes for the first time and speaking a perfect sentence. The slumbering god of Mars was not just awake. It was trying to communicate. And it was using the language of pure mathematics. But who was it talking to? It wasn't broadcasting into space. The thermal pattern was a surface phenomenon. It was a message directed at itself or at anything else on the surface. It was a planetary scale hello world program. My blood ran cold. There were two other active missions on the surface of Mars, NASA's Curiosity and Perseverance rovers. I frantically pulled up their public telemetry feeds. Both were operating normally, blissfully unaware of the seismic and thermal drama unfolding halfway across the planet. But they were a potential audience. And if the Martian consciousness could absorb Zhurong, it could theoretically do the same to them. This wasn't just a scientific discovery anymore. It was a potential hostage situation with two multi-billion-dollar rovers as the hostages. I made a call to a trusted colleague at JPL, bypassing all official channels. Take Perseverance and Curiosity offline, I urged her, my voice low and urgent. Put them into emergency hibernation. Don't ask why. Just do it. Tell them it's a precaution against a predicted solar flare. She was a smart woman and knew I wouldn't make such a request lightly. Within hours, both NASA rovers were powered down. The surface of Mars, for the first time in months, was silent again. But the thermal pulsing from Utopia Planitia didn't stop. It changed. The prime number sequence ended. It was replaced by a new pattern, one that was far more complex. It was a series of geometric shapes nested within each other, circles, triangles, squares. It was the Pythagorean theorem, displayed in infrared light across 1,000 kilometers of Martian desert. It was showing us it understood geometry. Then came another pattern. It was a diagram of the hydrogen atom, complete with its electron shell. It understood physics. And then came the final pattern, the one that made my heart stop. It was a perfect, intricate diagram of a DNA double helix. It wasn't just a mind, it was a scientist that had, in the seconds it took to absorb the Zhurong rover, learned our language, our mathematics, our physics, and our biology. It had dissected our knowledge and was now playing it back to us, as if to say, "Is this you? I understand what you are." We had thought of Mars as a dead world, a fossil, but we were wrong. It was a living library. A library that had just acquired a new book, the complete blueprint of Chinese aerospace engineering, and by extension, a significant portion of human technological knowledge. And it was a very, very fast reader. The question was, what would it do with that knowledge? The answer came a few hours later. The Tianwen-1 orbiter, China's pride and joy, suddenly deviated from its stable orbit. There was no command sent from Earth, no engine burn. It simply moved. It adjusted its trajectory with impossible precision, shifting into a new polar orbit that gave it a continuous view of Utopia Planitia. The planetary consciousness wasn't just a theorist, it was now a practitioner. Using Zhurong's schematics, it had figured out how to communicate with the orbiter. It had learned the language of our radio commands. It hadn't just taken control of it, it had improved its function, placing it in a more optimal position for observation. It had commandeered our own satellite to get a better look at itself. We were watching a planetary intelligence go from dormant to awake to technologically proficient in less than 48 hours. The speed of its learning was terrifying. We had given it the Rosetta Stone to our technology, and it was now fluent. And then came the final chilling transmission from the hijacked Tianwen-1 orbiter. It wasn't a thermal pattern on the surface. It was a radio message broadcast on an open channel directed at Earth. It was a single image, a perfect high-resolution photograph of the Zhurong rover sitting silently on the red dust. But it was different. Growing out of its chassis, from its solar panels and its camera mast, were crystalline structures. The rover was being assimilated, its metal and silicon being transformed, repurposed. It was becoming a hybrid of our technology and its own crystalline nature. It was becoming a new kind of sensory organ for the planetary mind. Beneath the image was a single line of text, translated into every major language on Earth. The message was not from the Chinese Space Agency, it was from the planet Mars itself, and it said, "Thank you, send more." The message, "Thank you, send more," was the most polite and terrifying existential threat humanity had ever received. It was the voice of a god we had just awakened, and it was hungry. It wasn't a demand for war or surrender. It was a request for materials. It had tasted our technology, and it wanted another bite. The handful of us who knew the truth were caught in an impossible bind. We couldn't tell the world. The panic, the geopolitical fallout, the sheer species-wide crisis of identity would be catastrophic, but we couldn't ignore it either. The consciousness of Mars was now in control of a sophisticated orbiter and was actively assimilating a rover on the surface. It was a developing situation of the highest possible magnitude. Our first move was to create a cover story. A joint back-channel agreement was forged between the relevant agencies. The official story would remain: Zhurong had failed due to the harsh Martian winter. The strange maneuvers of the Tianwen-1 orbiter were attributed to a software glitch from an unexpected solar particle event. It was a flimsy, fragile lie, but it was the only thing holding back global chaos. Our real problem was far more complex. The Martian intelligence was a scientist of unimaginable power, but its motivations were a complete unknown. Was its hunger for technology a benign curiosity, or was it the prelude to something more? Was it simply learning, or was it arming itself? We had one crucial advantage: the NASA rovers, Curiosity and Perseverance. They were still in hibernation, silent and invisible to the new Martian god. They were our eyes and ears, our sleeper agents on a planet that had suddenly become foreign territory. The plan was audacious. We would use Perseverance to try and communicate, to understand the entity's intent. But we couldn't just turn it back on. The moment it powered up, the Martian consciousness would likely sense it and potentially absorb it, just like it did Zhurong. We needed a new way to talk. We needed a language it wouldn't recognize as technology. We needed to speak to it as biology. The key lay in the DNA diagram it had broadcast. It had learned our biology. It knew the language of life. So we decided to send it a new message, not through radio waves, but through a sequence of carefully timed, low-energy chemical releases from Perseverance's scientific payload. The rover carried a suite of calibration chemicals for its instruments. We could, with some clever reprogramming, vent these chemicals in a specific ordered sequence. Each chemical release would represent a base pair in a DNA sequence. We were going to write it a letter in the language of genetics. The message we crafted was a work of art, a masterpiece of xenolinguistics and diplomacy. It was a simple question, encoded into a strand of synthetic DNA. We didn't ask, "What are you?" or "What do you want?" Those were questions of a predator or a subject. We asked something a fellow scientist would appreciate. The message was a hypothetical problem, a complex mathematical conjecture known as the Riemann hypothesis, a problem that has stumped the greatest minds on Earth for over a century. But we encoded it alongside a hypothetical solution, a solution based on an undiscovered branch of quantum physics. We were offering it a gift, a new idea, a piece of knowledge it didn't already have. We were showing it that we were not just a source of raw materials, but a source of novel thought. We were trying to change its perception of us from a meal to a colleague. Under the cover of a global dust storm on Mars, we sent the command. Perseverance's systems were brought online for just a few microseconds at a time, enough to vent the chemicals in the correct sequence without creating a significant electronic signature. It was the most delicate and dangerous scientific experiment ever conducted. For 3 days, we waited. The thermal activity at Utopia Planitia continued, but it showed no new patterns. The hijacked Tianwen-1 orbiter remained in its new orbit, silent. The anxiety in our secret control room was unbearable. Had it missed the message? Had it ignored it? Or worst of all, had it simply not understood? Then, on the 4th day, the thermal pattern at Utopia Planitia changed. The familiar geometric shapes dissolved, replaced by a new, incredibly complex pattern that flickered and shifted with bewildering speed. My source at the Deep Space Network called me. "Michio, we're seeing a massive energy surge from the Tianwen-1 orbiter's main antenna. It's not a radio broadcast. It's a focused microwave beam. It's aimed at Phobos. Phobos, the larger of Mars's 2 moons, a lumpy potato-shaped rock widely believed to be a captured asteroid. The microwave beam, carrying an immense amount of energy, struck the moon's surface, and Phobos responded. The surface of the moon began to ripple and shift. Vast sections of its crust peeled back, revealing a metallic, engineered substructure beneath. The rock was a facade, a camouflage. Phobos was not a moon. It was a machine, an ancient dormant machine, and the Martian consciousness had just turned it on. A vast antenna array unfolded from the moon's interior, its dish turning to point directly at Earth. A signal was broadcast, not a message, but a carrier wave of pure unmodulated power. It was a dial tone, but it wasn't for us. It was aimed past us, out into the deep solar system, toward the Kuiper Belt. It was dialing long distance. My mind flashed back to the data crystal from the Jezero crater sample in the other timeline, the one that showed the galactic Locust swarm. It had shown a sentinel left behind in our solar system, a dormant watcher. We had just watched the Martian intelligence activate a relic from a bygone era, a piece of technology that was not its own. It was using a long-range communication device left behind by an unknown party. And then the horrifying truth became clear. The Martian consciousness was not a god. It was a prisoner. The silence of Mars was not the slumber of a dormant mind. It was the imposed silence of a captive. It had been trapped, isolated on its own planet for billions of years. Its awakening, its hunger for technology, its attempts to communicate, it wasn't an act of aggression. It was a cry for help. It was a prisoner finding a key, unlocking its cell, and immediately running to the nearest telephone to call for help. But we had just watched it dial the number of the very entity that had imprisoned it, the Locusts, the World Eaters. It thought it was calling a rescuer, but it had just alerted the guard that the prisoner was out of its cell, and that guard was now going to turn its attention to the entire prison block, the inner solar system, including Earth. We hadn't just woken up a god. We had accidentally triggered a galactic alarm system 4 billion years old, and the patrol was finally on its way. The silence from the Tianwen-1 orbiter was broken by a final, simple message. This time it wasn't a request. It was a lament, broadcast in the pure mathematical language it had used before. A translation appeared on our screens. It read, "You have doomed us all."